that's really important that we have now started with, instead of like diversity, equity, inclusion, it's equity, diversity, inclusion, because that takes into account like the level of where you're starting.
Yep.
So like you said, that foundation, a lot of places are just like, well, how do we even, how do we get diversity? We don't have it here. This needs to be a start. But we now know that when you're looking at these big like macro cultures, you have to adjust it. Like, okay, well, there is diversity here, but how can we make it either more inclusive, or we start looking at things through a lens of equity?
Right. That's been a huge question. Sometimes it like totally blows my mind. I'll give a speech and the number one question that comes up is it DEI or EDI or EDISJ or belonging? And I'm like, really?
Yeah.
And then I realized what you name, I'm a mother. I know what you name something is ridiculously important, right? A name has a tremendous amount of meaning. But it's also really interesting because there are so many people who have kind of a bad taste in their mouth around the word diversity. Right. Diversity has been used and not always had a shared interpretation or not had kind of satisfying outcomes. So people automatically have kind of a thing related to diversity itself. But also, in the absence of having a real obvious starting point as far as diversifying from a representational point of view, how is it that we can actually make meaningful, substantive, and the right level, right, that systems level change? And that's where equity lives. And so, I always tell people, like I've always said, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And sometimes when we work with clients, they already have the name of the initiative or the program that they're doing. And so we, of course, would honor whatever their preferences are. But for us, equity is absolutely foundational, right? Equity is always going to place where at a structural and systemic level, we can look around and say, on a day-to-day basis, was this system, this structure actually built based on an equitable model? If not, how is it that we find the places or the opportunities to disrupt, to interrogate, to make adjustments at that systemic level? And then from there, we can continue to do some of the other really important work related to diversity and inclusion, but not skipping over nor downplaying the really ridiculously important and heavy lifting work associated with equity.
Right. And I think like that's something that's so interesting is sometimes we go into these strategy clients and they're expecting us to hold a facilitation where people can talk about microaggressions they've seen in the workforce. And then they're like shocked where we're like, okay, what's your pay structure?
Right.
And they're like, that's not what we hired you for. And we're like, no, that's exactly what you hired us for, because that's, if we can't start there, then, that's a very like foundational base.
Yeah.
If you want to have an equitable workforce, we have to talk about pay structure. We have to talk about days off. We have to talk about parental leave. It's not anymore just like, oh, let's have a Cinco de Mayo lunch,
Exactly.
No longer just days on the calendar.
Yeah. We can't just talk about like King Jr. Day. We have to talk, it's like a full picture, which is still, I think, exactly what next generation leadership or next generation EDI is we're in that space where that full shift is happening.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's exciting too, but it's still something that people are bringing into focus because so many people who are in the workforce, there's a lot of newer and younger professionals, which is really exciting, who are coming in with without all those kind of old mental models about what it can and should look like. But there's also a lot of people, especially people in positional authority, who have D&I, not even the E, involved, and they have very specific and limited mental models about what's included, and their focus has been almost wholly on representation for the vast majority of their careers, right? It's the heavy emphasis on the diversity, and diversity equals representation. It's like a numbers game.
Right.
Yeah. And really, D&I, right, if we were going to have like a from to, is moving from things that are just focused on kind of representation or programmatic sorts of things to things that are like grassroots only, where people who are at the front lines of whatever the organization is are doing all the heavy lifting, all on a volunteer basis. They're not getting paid for the labor. They're not getting recognized. It's not part of a performance evaluation. It's not part of an advancement plan. Their voices are often underrepresented or underheard or valued. The decision-making authority doesn't sit with them. All of those are places that D&I has traditionally kind of sat. And it's also been pretty heavily focused on the HR side of the house. Not to diminish the HR side of the house, but that's not the place where a lot of the decisions are made about like the where to allocate business resources, right? And so now that shift, if we were going to go to the two, when the more contemporary model, the equity, diversity, and inclusion focus is much more holistic and integrated, and it's much more about at the system level, right? How is it that we think about how all of the work that we do as an organization, everything that we do is really about equity, diversity, and inclusion in ways that are much more integral.
Right.
And they absolutely include some of the HR sorts of things like talent management and hiring and recruitment and retention. But they also have to do with those really core things like equity and the salary basis.
Right.
But they also have to do with things like impact in your industry, or impact in your community, or supplier diversity, or how it is that you're taking things like your employee resource groups and reconstituting them so that people who are participating in your organization's equity, diversity, and inclusion goals are being seen as helping to drive something that is strategic, and also there's appropriate resourcing and support that's disseminated throughout the organization, not just for the few people who have been the passionate few who have been carrying the weight for so long.